Thank you. Morning, everyone. Good to be in. It's good to be here at a conference focused on family support. And I guess when Carmel asked me to do the talk, one of my responses was around that, as whether I was the right person to do it. And that wasn't just due to imposter syndrome, although that played part of it. But a lot of my work has been focused on a range of things in children's services. So there's been some work on family support, some on child protection, and some on work with children and young people in the care system and care leavers. But I guess that leads to an important point around seeing family support and child protection as connected activities. And in family support, the idea of focusing and taking account of children's well-being, children's rights, and child protection and prevention of future harm, which I think is a well-established argument. But also in child protection, about the idea that, yes, you might be working with families and parents in different ways, but there should be a strong family support element to that practice as well. And I think part of the issue is, perhaps not in Ireland, but in the UK and England, we have lost sight of that in practice, which is one of the things I will speak about. So I'm going to primarily focus on the hollowing out of family support. I'm primarily going to focus on England, but some of the arguments are relevant to the wider UK over the last 14 years. I've chosen that date for a specific reason. I'm secondly going to look at a small knowledge exchange study I was involved in, looking at housing issues and homelessness where children were on the edge of care, and just to speak a little bit about that. And I'm going to conclude by looking forward to how we might think about restoring a more family supportive children's services system within England and the UK, and hopefully finish in good time. Just following off on the previous speakers, the idea of family support, the definition of family support that I'll adopt is a very basic one around providing supports to families in order that children and young people can stay within their families. I will be speaking about children staying with their birth parent or a birth parent. That's the focus of what I'm speaking on today. It's not to say that family support can't also apply in other contexts. Indeed, I'm involved in a current study that looks at kinship carer families and their issues around housing and housing support. But just as a matter of focus, I will focus on that today. So just to start off, looking at care rates in the UK, this comes from a chapter that's under review that I've written with David Hayes, John Devaney and Alison Rees, and I've stolen the graph from that chapter. And as you see, the orange line there is Wales. So Wales's care rates have gone up in the period over the last 8 years that we had data for. And they've gone up more significantly than in other countries in the UK. Northern Ireland and England have gone up steadily, Northern Ireland's more recently. And Scotland's have actually gone down a little bit during that period. And you'll just have to take my word for it, but if I was to extend the graph a little bit, if we went back to earlier in 2000s and the mid-2000s, Scotland's care rates have gone up from that period before more recently coming down, and they did start from a higher rate as well. Now, this is a phenomenon that we see over a number of high-income countries in Europe, including systems where there have been previously arguments that they are more family-supportive services. It applies in Australasia. There are some exceptions as well. So the USA's care rates haven't gone up. We don't really understand in detail why some have and some haven't. But before giving the talk, I thought I'd better look at Ireland's care rates and just see that the arguments would land similarly in Ireland. So I contacted Kenneth Burns, who's an academic based in Ireland, who provided me with the Irish figures. And as you can see, Ireland's care rates, starting from a lower rate, have been really flat as a pancake. So I did think about renaming my talk about family support in an era of rising care rates, except in Ireland. But I decided not to, and it may be that what I talk about in England is a cautionary tale of what you shouldn't do. I understand as well that child protection plan rates, referral rates, and other indicators that we look at in terms of child and family social work activity are lower in Ireland. And from some of the reading I've done, I understand that that probably relates to some of the discussions that were there when Tulsa was set up about 10 years ago about having a family support orientation, but also about funding it as well. I'm aware that on the ground, the experiences of that might be different. I spent quite a lot of my life moving between England and Scotland, personally and professionally. And when I'm in England, quite a lot of people will say how bad things are down there and that things must be better in Scotland. And when I move to Scotland, people don't say things are better in England, but they talk about also how things are really bad in Scotland. And they're not as good as people outside Scotland think they are. So I don't know, that might come across. And obviously, being around children's services for a period of time, I imagine issues of funding, issues of workloads, and other frustrations are going to be there. But certainly from an outside glance, it does seem that Ireland has got some things right that the rest of the UK, and particularly England, hasn't. So I just wanted to go back to thinking about care rates and just about why these might be a problem. And it might seem a strange question at a family support conference, but there have been people in England not so long ago, both researchers and policymakers, that have said we actually shouldn't be worried about rising care rates and we should actually want more people in the care system. And they did so not out of malice, but because there was some evidence that children's well-being and outcomes for them improved in the care system. So why is it a problem? Well, first of all, in terms of legal and moral mandates about keeping families together. Secondly, also in terms of the outcomes, even if some children's well-being improves in the care system, we know that isn't true for all children and young people. We know there continues to be difficulties in the care system. We need to be careful not to stigmatise the care system through arguing for family support. But we know that particularly at transition points, at placement breakdown times, and when children and young people leave the care system, that the transitional support isn't as good and they can struggle for a period of time. Thirdly, in terms of expense, so the most expensive part of the children's services system in any country is placing children in care. And as Karen said, I have done some work recently on private provision, and one of the issues that I think cuts across in Ireland as well as England and the UK is that there's been a big rise in profit-making providers. So around 80% of residential childcare provision in England is now for profit. A lot of this is now large global financial firms rather than small-run family firms. And around 40% of all placement provision, foster care and residential care is for profit, and again, large companies. And they are making on average over 20% profit. So money that is tight, that could and should be going to a stretch family support system and a stretch children's services system is being taken out in profits because of the way services haven't been well configured. So just to say a little bit more about England's care numbers. So if you look at England's care rates, they've gone up, but not massively, partly because of the greater size of the country. But if you take a longer look, England's care numbers have been going up for a number of years since the 90s. They plateaued a bit in the New Labour years, but they've been on a broadly upward trajectory from around 50,000 children in the mid-90s to now we have over 80,000 children in care in England now. And in terms of one of the issues that's been raised, we had a recent government-commissioned review of children's services that highlighted the lack of support from for families and has also shone a light on the fact that children's services and social workers are investigating a lot and don't seem to be providing support. Graph looking at child protection plans and Section 47 inquiries in England. So a Section 47 inquiry is where there's belief that a child has or may suffer significant harm, and there's basically a child protection investigation. And as you can see in the yellow bars, the number of Section 47 inquiries has nearly doubled in the last 10 years. If we were to take it back even further to the mid-2000s, we'd see that Section 47 inquiries have in fact quadrupled. And yet child protection plans, so when you have a Section 47 inquiry, there are two main outcomes. There are others at the margins, but the two main outcomes are either you'll have an initial child protection conference looking at whether children should be placed on a child protection plan, or you'll look at providing support through family support mechanisms outside of that. But we see that child protection plans remain broadly flat. So we've got a lot more investigation going on without children then being found to have experienced significant harm. And we know that overall we could construct an argument that say, look, this might not be such a bad thing. It could be that social workers go in there, they discuss a family support needs, they provide advice, and this helps a family. But we know from studies and from feedback from parents groups that parents find these processes enormously stressful. They don't feel that they are supported, and they've got to focus on assessment rather than the provision of support. So nearly 75% now of Section 47 inquiries result in not a finding that it should go to a child protection plan. So lots of assessment activity, lots of investigative activity, but little evidence of family support activity. This was also a feature of a study that I did with Harry Churchill around 10 years ago of an intensive family support service in the north of England. And the Intensive Family Support Service worked alongside child and family social workers. And we looked at 8 case study families in detail. I wrote up a case study of one of the families. Now, this is one family for whom there was very significant concerns. There was about 4 There were 4 children in the household. There'd been a range of concerns. I won't go into the detail of them, but they were kind of similar to a range of family functioning difficulties, concerns about the children's development that are evident in many child and family social work. And during the 2 years that the Intensive Family Support Service had worked with the family, they had made, what I'd say was, from a service point of view, spectacular progress. So the children were doing much better in school, the parents' relationship was much better, they were working with services far better. The children were off the child protection plans, and the social work team were looking to close the case. I wasn't convinced, looking at all the details of the case, that this wouldn't be a family that might need some further support from social work services further down the line. But nonetheless, in formal terms, their progress had been significant. And I interviewed them twice, and I asked them about the support they'd got from the Family Support Service and what was different about that from the social work service before the Family Support Service got involved. And they basically said the social workers would come in and they would tell them what wasn't going well, and then they would come and revisit 2 weeks later because the children were on child protection plan and the children had to be seen every 2 weeks, and they would lecture them about what hadn't been progressed and what was going wrong. They wouldn't actually provide any support. And there was one particular incident that stood in the family's memory, the parents' memory, really, really graphically. And this is when they just moved into a new house, it has to be said, with social work support, who had helped them get a private tenancy and helped them get the deposit. And the parents had lost a previous tenancy through things that, in part, they had and hadn't done. But they just moved into this new tenancy, and having helped them get the tenancy, the social workers weren't helping them do anything. So it wasn't furnished, it wasn't equipped. And in a fairly short period of time between the 2-week visits, the parents went out and basically salvaged carpets and furniture. And this is what they had to say. So the father says, we just moved in, there were no carpets on the floor, there were no settee, and within a couple of weeks, I've got a carpet down and things, that table, new settee, I've got carpet in here. And the social worker just says, things haven't changed, have they? He didn't walk in and notice that we'd actually done anything. So that sense of social workers not actually helping the family in terms of equipping the house, but standing back and telling the family what they hadn't done and not noticing any progress that had been made. So in terms of what the Family Support Service were doing that was helpful, they had a strengths-based approach as well as a task-focused approach. So they would take the concerns that child and family social workers had and say, look, these are the concerns, these are the things that need addressing, but they would provide choices around how the family would address them and their priorities for that, not dissimilar to some practice frameworks that are currently used, including in Ireland. There was evidence of an empathic approach and engaging with where the parents were. There was evidence of a whole family approach in that they worked with the whole family, primarily with the parents, but they would also engage with where the children and young people were, and there were family-based activities. Crucially, I think there was a mixture of practical, material, affective, and psychological input. So it was both. It was engaging with where the parents were in terms of relationship difficulties, mental health difficulties, but also their history of engagement with social work services and their feelings of being mistreated by statutory social work services as well. It was what I would call a generic family support approach. It wasn't a manualised approach. It drew on research evidence, but it also had access to specialist services. So there were mental health and drug and alcohol services that they could refer to. It's worth saying as well, and it's not to deny, of course, policy is important, and it has an impact on how, in this field, that families are seen within their communities, how they see themselves, and also about resourcing. But it's worth saying as well that in England, there is a history over the last 25 years of government providing some support for families at the edge of care, and it's usually with a stigmatizing terminology and a stigmatizing set of policy narratives that play to a scapegoating narrative around problematic, troublesome, other kinds of families, and using that kind of discourse. I mean, it's worth acknowledging that on the ground, this service was still managing to provide needed support on the practice level, despite the policy framings. Now, there is a kind of limit to how far that can go. You get to a certain limit of policy where that isn't possible, but it's worth noting that there isn't always a fit between the positiveness of practice and the positiveness of policy, certainly formal policy framing. The final thing that I want to say just on this, and I think it is something just to bear in mind in terms of working with families where children are on the edge of care, is that although the family had made really massive progress, there were still some issues. They were on short income, neither of them was working, they were in a private tenancy, there was further welfare residualisation coming down the road in England, so it was likely that they were going to struggle financially. The mother in the family had long-term mental health problems, and although she was coping much better, hadn't accessed mental health service support. So there were various vulnerabilities, if I can use that term, that meant that the family may struggle in future. And they may need to come back to social work services as well. So I think we need to be careful with this idea. Yes, the preventative aspect of family support is really important, but where families have had long-term difficulties, we need to be careful about assuming that they won't need further support down the line. And that also means as well that child and family social work needs to be able to provide some of the kinds of support that the intensive family support service were doing, but were not doing before they got the intensive family support service involved. Now, the local authority in question, I was a social work educator in the region at the time, and I knew some children and family social workers that worked in that local authority. So I was speaking to them about the research that we were doing and their experiences, and speaking about one of the things that some of the families had said about not feeling supported by social workers and being assessed and surveyed. And they would talk about things like workload. These were bright students with strong values. They would talk about things like workload. They would talk about the assessment and bureaucratic burden of their role. And some also would talk about whether they didn't see this kind of family support work as part of their role. And I think that's been part of the problem of the way that services have been constructed in England in recent years. So one of the things I wanted to speak about in terms of why England has got to the stage it is around poverty. And if you look at poverty rates in England, this is a graph that I've stolen from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which in turn took the information from the DWP, a government department in England. What you see is that, yes, there's been some changes up and down. The two lines that we're most interested in probably here are the rate of poverty for children and the working age adults with children poverty line. And that poverty in the UK is higher than in Ireland, but not massively higher, so it's around just over 20%, Ireland's around 20%. So we don't see an exact fit between the poverty levels and the rising care rates, or a really obvious explanation in themselves. But we do see changing poverty rates, both for working age parents and for children. And we actually see a dip in the late 2010s, which came from governments starting to make greater investment in welfare support and also some other support services, and that continued in terms of COVID. So one of the takeaways from this is that this is one area where government knows that if it pulls certain policy levers, it can make a difference. But nonetheless, not an obvious fit with the rising care rates and the headline poverty levels that you see on this graph. And this made possible the denial of poverty. So the top quotation is a quotation from quite a famous speech by Michael Gove, who was a Minister for Education at the time. With the current election in the UK as well, Michael Gove has just announced that he's stepping down from the Cabinet and from Parliament. I imagine most of you know who he is. If you don't, he's been a Tory minister for since 2010 with short gaps at periods of time. And whatever criticisms may be levied against him, I think people would say that he's a very effective political operator, that he knows how to get policies through, he's a good media operator. But it also has to be said, I think his tenure as Minister for Education has left a litany of really poor decisions that England is still picking up the pieces from. So in this speech, which was to the NSPCC, after lambasting social work educators for what he says is taking kind of idealistic students and telling them that families' problems were socially caused, he says, social workers overly influenced by this analysis not only rob families of a proper sense of responsibility, they also abdicate their own. They see their job as securing the family's access to services provided by others, rather than helping them to change their own approach to life. Instead of working with individuals to get them to recognize harmful patterns of behavior and improve their own lives, some social workers acquiesce in or make excuses for these wrong choices. Now, like all cleverly phrased arguments, there's a kernel of truth there. Of course, there are within families individual harms, and there needs to be some individual behavioural change. And families need to do that for themselves to a certain degree. The old kind of joke about how many social workers does it take to change a light bulb? None, because the light bulb needs to want to change itself. So there's an element of truth there. But the idea that that is in opposition to helping families access services, and that we shouldn't be doing both in child and family social work, I think tells you a lot about why you saw the statistics that I started off with. Now, we have been blessed in recent years by some really incisive, impactful, detailed research about the impacts between poverty and care rates. And I think one of the issues was that we didn't have this research published and impacting at the time that Gove and others were making their arguments. But one of the best well-known studies was led by Paul Bywaters, who's at the University of Huddersfield, and they looked across the 4 UK countries about connections between deprivation and children's entry into care. Lots of detailed findings, but one of the headline ones is that the 10% most deprived neighbourhoods in the UK are 12 times more likely to see children enter state care than the 10% least deprived. And that was something we probably suspected, but we didn't have the tip of the tongue evidence to say. And that also then, of course, puts a laser on what child and family social workers are doing. Are we merely penalising families due to their poverty rather than helping families? More recently, a further study has shown a direct impact of child poverty on care rates. So using various detailed statistical methods that fly over my head, they estimated that 8.1%, around 10,000 children who entered state care between 2015 and 20 were due to rises in child poverty. So it doesn't explain all of it, but it explains some of it. I thought this graph was interesting as well. So it's from the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is basically a club of the richest countries in the world, there are 38 of them, and produces some data on various indicators to do with all of the countries. And one of the things that it produces is this analysis of the poverty gap. So the poverty gap is a ratio by which the mean income of the poor falls below the poverty line. In other words, it's a measure of how far the left behind are left behind in each country. And one of the interesting things that it shows is that even though Ireland's overall poverty rate isn't massively different to the UK rate, in terms of the poverty gap, Ireland has the lowest, in other words, the best score in terms of the poverty gap, whereas the UK has the fourth lowest, comes to 34th out of 38 countries. And that, I think, helps provide some of the other part of the reasons why child care rates have gone up in the UK, is that the left behind are really left behind and they struggle to get resources to family well, to parent well. And the final part of the equation, I think, has been around austerity cuts. So it's been a combination of austerity, service cuts, and poverty. So when the Conservatives got back into power in 2010, the first George Osborne budget planned 30% cuts to local authority budgets. These were unprecedented. Up until that time, local authorities had planned for year-on-year increases, maybe modest increases. Now suddenly they're having to cut a third of their budgets. A really pernicious element of this that Osborne introduced was that it hit poor areas harder. So there was a change in some of the funding formula elements, which meant that more deprived areas suffered from more cuts. These are overwhelmingly Labour areas, so there was a political kind of a political angle to it, but a decision that I think is completely unjustifiable. And it wasn't just the cuts, but the nature of the cuts. So you had the bedroom tax, where people had what was decided to be an extra bedroom that they didn't need and they were in social housing. They lost housing benefit. Some families would need them because they had a family with a child with a disability and they sometimes needed to sleep with the child and sometimes needed another room. Initially, foster carers fell foul of this, but an exemption was made. Other exemptions weren't made. A 2-child limit on child benefit. So if you have more than 2 children, you don't get child benefit for the additional children. And a university credit rollout that has left some poor families without income at all for a period of time in rent arrears. And the effects of that, I think, have been to make poorer families very, very wary of the welfare state, over and beyond the cuts made, but just really wary about the idea that this state is there to support them. And the final element of it is around spending on children's services. So when the Tory austerity plans first came in, they cut spending to local authorities. Local authorities cut spending on services, but they protected child protection, inverted commas, services. So child and family social work numbers didn't go down. What did go down was funding on early interventions services and how they went down. So there's been an almost 50% cut in early intervention services between 2010 and 2012. And based on government figures, the IFS looked at a slightly different definition of preventative services, including services for older young people like family centres, youth groups, youth centres, community centres, and estimated that there was a 60% cut. Now, some of these things will have been formal intensive family support, some of them the semi-formal support that the previous speakers spoke about, and some of that semi-formal support about supports that families and young people could access as and when they needed, that didn't have a stigmatizing element, that allowed them to choose when they wanted to access these services, and that has been really cut away. So I think that's the final part of the jigsaw about why you saw the opening graph that I showed you. I'm going to cover this quite briefly because I want to move on to the issue of homelessness. But just to say, even if I sometimes imply otherwise, everything that the Tory government has done since 2010 hasn't been bad. Even it just feels that it has been a lot of the time. So one of the things they did do was invest in what they called innovation projects, which were new ways of working in children's services. And one of them I was involved in the evaluation of was Family Valued in the Leeds areas, so a model of restorative practice where essentially they looked at how they could work with families instead of doing to them. And family group conferencing was at the centre of their offer, so every family that came to initial child protection conferences were offered a family group conference. And what we saw in Leeds over a period where care rates were going up significantly in the UK, starting from a higher average care rate, Leeds' rate went down year upon year. And indeed, the rate of increase of the decreases of Leeds' rate made it an exceptional case in that whilst care rates had started to increase at a lower level, Leeds went in the opposite direction with an increasing rate of decrease. So what Leeds had done was really impressive, and practice leadership within Leeds was important on that. But it's also important to say that in the wider policy context I've spoken about, of increasing austerity, of stigmatising cuts, and a wider child welfare system that had turned towards an investigative, assessment, and punitive type of practice, despite, I have to say, what practitioners would want to do, meant that Leeds were fighting against the tide, and that these decreases weren't seen more broadly, but also that Leeds were constantly having to work within a system in a restorative way, work within a non-restorative system in a restorative way, and eventually that becomes, I think, sometimes overwhelming. So I want to move on in the remaining time just to look at a small project I've been involved in around housing and homelessness for children, for families where children are on the edge of care. The genesis of the study was that I was a member, and still am a member of the British Association of Social Work, the largest representative body of social workers in the UK, and I was part of a Children and Families Committee. And as the committee, we were getting anecdotal reports from third sector organisations that social workers were either threatening to or placing children in care where housing and homelessness was a major issue, which would go against social work values and arguably would go against key parts of the legislation that we have. Underlying this, we know that there's a lack of affordable quality housing in the UK. There's been a shrinkage of social housing provision since the 80s, rise of private sector housing, and increased needs for housing, partly through population growth. COVID accentuated that as well, and there's, as a result, been increasing rates of increasing lack of affordable housing. We do know that this issue isn't restricted to England, that it's an issue throughout Europe and included in Ireland. So, and I hope I don't totally murder this surname, Haran and Oshakru and Hearn and Murphy showed that in Ireland, for example, in 2016, 40,000 households were waiting for social housing for over 4 years. Now, in England, there's a big gap between this well-sounding legislation and the function of it in terms of housing. So any family that has dependent children is automatically identified as having priority need for rehousing. But in reality, is gatekeeping, so for example, whether a family have made themselves intentionally homeless or not, and also whether they have a local connection or not, are sometimes used to screen families out. And one of the net impact of all of those things, has been that there's been a big rise in families living in temporary accommodation. So in 2020, over 128,000 families were living in temporary accommodation, and that was a 75% increase. We know that being homeless has an impact on family functioning, psychological well-being, education, and stability for children. And we also know, although this wasn't a focus of this project, but it's worth noting, that Poor quality housing also impacts on mental health, but also children's physical health. There was a recent high-profile case of a child named Awab Ishak, aged 2, who died from a respiratory disease due to mold in his house. And the parents had made repeated requests to the social housing provider, the local authority, to make the repair, and they hadn't. But this brought to the surface something that's been going on a lot longer around the impact of poor quality housing as well. So as part of the work, we did a relatively quick and brief literature review. It emphasised that housing and social work have been working in silos, both in research and practice and policy. But it identified two distinct groups. Firstly, families who already had child and family social work involvement and a range of issues and needs, and for whom housing and homelessness, or the risk of homelessness, was an additional issue. And secondly, migrant families who are subject to no recourse to public funds. So the no recourse to public funds was actually brought in under New Labour in the late 90s, and it's a condition that imposes strict restrictions on the social rights to public assistance of migrants who are subject to immigration controls, including their right to state housing. So we did a brief survey of social workers. It was a quick online survey during COVID, so it's not representative in any way, but it is illustrative. And it illustrated that in child and family social workers' experiences, those who responded to the survey, that housing wasn't the main issue, that they were saying, look, no, we're not placing children in care just because of the housing, but it was either a major issue or a contributory factor in children's entry into care. They were also saying in their comments that the reasons for family homelessness were complex and there was an interplay of factors. So there were other family difficulties which reinforced the difficulties with housing, and the difficulty with housing, and particularly homelessness, then reinforced the difficulties within the family. And social workers tended to see in their responses... Okay. What's the best way of finishing up? So social workers tended to see supporting families as a housing role, but there were some good relationships with housing providers. These tended to break down a little bit when it came to issues where the housing department weren't seeing the issues as being acknowledged housing issues. And there was frustrations about no recourse to public funds as well. I'll just fast forward onto the recommendations. So there were a series of recommendations, some of which were already in policy train, but part of them were about social workers and family support workers letting families know about their rights around housing and trying to maximise the support that there was there within the system. So there was evidence that social workers were sometimes informing families that they didn't have right to family support funds when they in fact did. We also recommended that social workers recorded the reason if children came into care, that they recorded that, and they recorded housing needs within the information that they recorded on the social work systems, so that this could be amalgamated and there could be a clear picture of housing needs and its connection to people's entry into care. So I'll just fast forward to the conclusion. Using England as a cautionary tale, I think we can say that what has happened in England is a really, really good model for what not to do with family support. So investment in family support is needed. Practice and practice leadership are important, but they can't be a substitute for reducing poverty and funding services properly. Investment in family support matters. It matters morally and practically in terms of keeping families together and for preventing more serious problems developing. But it's also really important from a pragmatic financial point of view, that rather than investing at the late stage and giving money to global financial chains through profits made through placement, we invest it on helping families and helping families stay together. Part of that transition in the UK needs to be away from a heavily risk assessment procedural model, and part of that needs to be around distinguishing between necessary and unnecessary bureaucracy. A final, penultimate point, that policy is important, but I think it's also important for practitioners to realise that there are things that practitioners can do to maximise support within the legal frameworks and the policy frameworks that are there, even if the policy frameworks aren't as positive as we would like them to be. And I'll finish on the point that child protection activity is family support and not a separate activity. In Scotland, we started using the phrase in the early 2000s that child protection is everyone's responsibility. It was a catchy phrase, and maybe we now need a phrase that says family support is everyone's responsibility. Thank you.